Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The chipped mug warmed my hands as I stared out the kitchen window. Another Tuesday. The sky was that particular shade of undecided gray that often hung over our town of Oakhaven in early November, not quite promising rain, not yet offering sun. My husband, Tom, had left for work at the paper mill an hour ago, his usual peck on my cheek still a faint, dry memory. 30 years of marriage, and our mornings had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. It wasn't a bad rhythm, mind you. Comfortable. Safe. But sometimes, like today, the silence in the house after he left felt a little too vast, a little too empty. I'm Sarah, by the way. 56 years young, as I like to tell myself, though some mornings my reflection argues the point. Our 2 children, Emily and Mark, had flown the nest years ago, building their own lives, their own noisy mornings, in cities far away. I was proud of them, of course, but their absence had carved out a quiet space in my life that I hadn't quite figured out how to fill. Not completely. I took a slow sip of my tea, the Earl Grey, a familiar comfort. My days stretched ahead, a blank canvas of household chores, maybe a trip to the library, the evening's dinner to plan. Exciting stuff, right? I sighed, a small puff of air that barely disturbed the steam rising from my mug. It wasn't that I was unhappy. Tom was a good man, steady and kind, if a little unobservant at times. We had a life we'd built together, solid and dependable. But there were moments, quiet moments like this one, when a yearning for something more, something different, would surface. A flicker of the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed of adventures beyond Oakhaven, who felt things with a startling intensity. I often wondered where that girl had gone, or if she was just buried under layers of routine and responsibility. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop, a sharp, intrusive sound in the morning stillness. Probably just a reminder for my dental appointment next week, or one of those never-ending group chats with my sisters. I dried my hands on the dish towel and picked it up. Unknown number. That was unusual. Most of my contacts were programmed in. Curiosity piqued. I tapped the notification. The message was short, just one sentence, but it made the blood freeze in my veins, then rushed to my head with a disorienting surge. My breath hitched. It read, "The garden is dying, Eleanor, and I think a part of me is dying with it. I can't do this anymore." Eleanor? My name is Sarah. I reread the message, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't for me.
It was clearly a mistake.
But the words, they were so raw, so full of despair. Who would send something so personal, so deeply vulnerable, to a wrong number? I looked at the number again. It wasn't familiar. My mind raced. Who did Tom know named Eleanor? No one sprang to mind. The message itself felt heavy, like a stone dropped into the placid pool of my morning. The garden is dying, a part of me is dying with it. It was poetic. In a terribly sad way, a strange feeling washed over me, a mix of shock, confusion, and an unexpected pang of empathy for this unknown sender and this Eleanor, whoever she was. The message felt like a window into a very private sorrow, a window I had no right to be looking through. My first instinct was to delete it, to pretend I'd never seen it. It was a mistake, after all. None of my business. But the words echoed in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. I can't do this anymore. That sounded serious. Desperate, even. Then, another message from the same number pinged through, just seconds later. Oh my God. Wrong person. Please, please delete that. I am so sorry. Disregard. The relief that flooded through me was quickly followed by a wave of acute awkwardness. The sender now knew their mistake. They must be mortified. I could only imagine their horror. I should just text back, "No problem, deleted," and leave it at that. That would be the polite, sensible thing to do. But that first message, it had struck a chord somewhere deep inside me. It spoke of a loneliness, a weariness that felt familiar in a strange way. Not the dying garden part, specifically. My own small patch of petunias and hydrangeas was doing reasonably well, considering the advancing autumn, but the underlying ache of feeling overwhelmed, of something precious slipping away. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What was the right thing to do? Before I could decide, the phone rang. The same unknown number. My heart leaped into my throat. He was calling now. To apologize further? To make sure I deleted it?
My mean spoon.
Should I answer? It felt intensely invasive, yet the raw emotion in that first text had created a strange, unwilling connection. This person was clearly in distress. With a deep breath, a little shaky, I pressed the green icon. "Hello," I said, my voice coming out a little huskier than usual. A man's voice answered, rushed and flustered. "Hello, yes, I am so incredibly sorry. I sent that previous text to you by mistake. It was meant for someone else. Please, I just need to know you'll delete it and disregard it." It was a terrible error. The voice.
There was something about it.
A timbre. A particular way of forming words that tickled at the edges of my memory. It sounded educated, perhaps a little formal despite the current panic. "It's all right," I said, trying to sound calm and reassuring. "I understand. I'll delete it. No harm done."
Thank you.
"Thank you so much.
I
appreciate your discretion." He sounded immensely relieved, but still stressed. There was an underlying tremor in his tone. And then it clicked. Like a key turning in a rusty lock, the identity of the voice slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. My eyes widened, and I think I might have made a small gasping sound. The unknown number. The distinct, slightly gravelly baritone. The formal, even in distress, turn of phrase. There was only one person it could be. It was Mr. Abernathy. Arthur Abernathy. Tom's boss. The owner and CEO of Abernathy Paper Products, the mill that had been the lifeblood of Oakhaven and Tom's employer for the past 35 years. The man Tom always referred to with a mixture of respect and a healthy dose of trepidation. Mr. Abernathy, the stern, no-nonsense businessman, known for his sharp suits, sharper mind, and an almost legendary inscrutability. The man who rarely, if ever, showed a flicker of emotion in public, that Mr. Abernathy, sending a message about a dying garden and a dying part of himself? It was shocking. Unbelievable, even. This was the man who addressed the company at the annual Christmas party with speeches about fiscal responsibility and market shares, not heartbroken poetry about lost hope. My mind reeled. Tom's boss. The implications started to swirl. What on earth was going on? And who was Eleanor? I suddenly felt like I was standing on the edge of something far more complex and unsettling than a simple wrong number. The image of the powerful, aloof Mr. Abernathy confessing such vulnerability was so incongruous, so startling. It left me utterly speechless, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the faint sound of his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. He must have sensed my silence, perhaps my shock.
"Mang?
"Are you still there?" Mr. Abernathy's voice, though still edged with anxiety, regained a fraction of its usual composure. It was a voice accustomed to command, to having its queries answered promptly. "Yes," I managed, my own voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I'm here. And Mr. Abernathy, it's Sarah. Sarah Sterling. Tom Sterling's wife." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound I could hear the faint hum of my refrigerator in the background. I imagined him, this formidable man, processing this new, even more awkward piece of information. His deeply personal, mistakenly sent text hadn't just gone to a random stranger, it had landed in the hands of an employee's wife. The potential for embarrassment, for workplace gossip, for complications, it was immense. My own stomach twisted with a fresh wave of discomfort, not just for him, but for Tom too. This was a landmine. "Mrs. Sterling," he finally said, and his voice was carefully neutral now, all traces of the earlier panic meticulously smoothed away, replaced by a veneer of polite formality, like a hastily drawn curtain over a chaotic scene. "I see.
Well,
This is most unfortunate. I reiterate my profound apologies for the intrusion and the error." It's quite all right, Mr. Abernathy," I stammered, trying to sound reassuring, though my mind was still whirring. "As I said, I'll delete the message. It won't go any further." I meant it. Despite the shock, or perhaps because of it, a protective instinct kicked in for him, strangely enough, and certainly for Tom. The last thing Tom needed was for his boss to feel exposed or compromised because of an accidental text to me. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. Your discretion is greatly appreciated. More than you know." There was a hint of something in his tone then, something beyond mere politeness. A weariness, perhaps? Or was I just imagining it, colored by the raw emotion of that first message? "Of course," I replied softly. "You have a good day, Mr. Abernathy. And you, Mrs. Sterling." He hung up. I slowly lowered the phone, my hand trembling slightly. I stared at the screen, at the number that was no longer unknown but now represented a person I thought I knew, or at least knew of. The stern, unshakable Mr. Abernathy. My mind flashed back to the text. "The garden is dying, Eleanor, and I think a part of me is dying with it. I can't do this anymore." Who was Eleanor? His wife. I knew Mrs. Abernathy had passed away some years ago. Tom had mentioned it. A brief illness, very sudden. He'd said Mr. Abernathy had taken it hard, become even more reclusive, more focused on work, if that were possible. Could Eleanor have been his wife, and he was still, years later, lost in his grief? The thought sent a fresh pang of sympathy through me that I did as I promised. I deleted the first, heart-wrenching message, and then the second, apologetic one. Wiped them from my phone. But I couldn't wipe them from my mind. The image of Mr. Abernathy, not as the titan of local industry, but as a grieving man struggling with despair, was seared into my memory. It was a glimpse behind a carefully constructed facade, a facade so convincing that no one in Oakhaven, probably not even Tom, would ever suspect the depths of sorrow it concealed. The rest of my morning passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my usual routine, tidying the living room, planning dinner, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that voice on the phone, to those shockingly vulnerable words. It felt like I was carrying a secret, a heavy, fragile thing that didn't belong to me, but had been thrust into my keeping nonetheless. I wondered if Tom had any idea about his boss's private struggles. Probably not. Tom was observant about engine noises and mill production quotas, but the subtle currents of human emotion often passed him by, not out of unkindness, but simply because his mind was wired differently. I found myself looking at my own small garden through the kitchen window with new eyes. The petunias were indeed fading with the first frosts, their vibrant colors muted. A metaphor for something ending, for loss. Was that what Mr. Abernathy felt about his Eleanor, about his life without her? A slow, inevitable dying of something beautiful? The thought made my own quiet life, my own comfortable routines, feel both precious and, in a strange way, a little more poignant. I had Tom. We had our shared history, our quiet companionship. Maybe it wasn't always thrilling, but it was alive. It wasn't a dying garden. As the day wore on, a subtle tension began to coil within me. What if Mr. Abernathy regretted that I knew? What if he worried I might tell Tom, or worse, someone else? His reputation in our small town was built on strength, on control. This accidental revelation of his inner turmoil could feel like a significant breach to a man like him. I hoped my reassurances had been enough. I hoped he believed me. The thought of causing Tom any trouble at work, however inadvertently, was deeply unsettling. By late afternoon, as the gray sky began to darken towards evening, I was still turning the incident over in my mind. The shock had lessened, replaced by a persistent thrum of empathy and a growing sense of something else. A connection? No, that was too strong a word. But an awareness, perhaps. An awareness that behind the masks people wear, even the most formidable ones, there are often hidden sorrows, hidden battles being fought. It made the world feel a little more complex, a little more fragile. And it made me feel a little less alone in my own quiet yearnings for something more, though my yearnings were pale shadows compared to the profound grief that seemed to envelope Tom's boss. The man I thought was just Mr. Abernathy had suddenly become Arthur, a fellow human being walking a difficult path. And I, Sarah Sterling, ordinary wife and mother from Oakhaven, was now the unlikely keeper of his secret sorrow. The question was what, if anything, would happen next? Or would this just be a strange, unsettling blip, a secret I would carry alone in the quiet spaces of my days? Tom came home around 6, smelling faintly of sulfur and damp cardboard, the signature scent of the paper mill. He kissed my cheek, the gesture as familiar and comforting as the evening news starting up on the small kitchen television. "Anything interesting happened today, Sal?" he asked, reaching for the newspaper on the counter, his mind already half on the sports scores. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the words I couldn't say caught in my throat. "No, not really, dear," I replied, managing a small smile. "Just a quiet Tuesday." But as I turned to stir the simmering stew on the stove, I knew it wasn't true. It hadn't been just a quiet Tuesday. Not at all. And I had a feeling that the silence in our house, for me at least, would now hold a different kind of resonance, filled with the unspoken weight of Mr. Abernathy's unexpected, heartbreaking confession. The air in my own kitchen felt charged with the knowledge, with the ghost of that desperate text. I wondered if Tom noticed the slightly distracted look in my eyes, the way my gaze kept drifting towards my phone, now sitting innocently on the counter, as if it hadn't been the conduit for such a profound and unsettling revelation just hours before. He didn't seem to. He was already engrossed in an article about the local high school football team. And in that moment, I felt a pang of loneliness that was sharper than usual, a direct result of the secret I now held, a secret I couldn't share even with him. The evening unfolded as it always did. Dinner, a bit of television, Tom dozing off in his armchair by 9. I found myself watching him, this man I knew so well, yet who seemed, in that moment, a world away from the emotional complexities that had unexpectedly touched my day. His face, relaxed in sleep, was peaceful. He wasn't burdened by anyone else's dying gardens or existential despair, beyond perhaps the mill's quarterly profit margins. There was a certain comfort in his predictability, his steadiness, but tonight, it also highlighted the solitude of my own internal experience. Later, as I lay in bed, staring up at the familiar patterns of shadows on the ceiling, Mr. Abernathy's words returned to me, unbidden. "The garden is dying, Eleanor." Who was Eleanor? His late wife, almost certainly. I recalled Tom mentioning her name was indeed Eleanor when she passed. The pain in that message, years after her death, was palpable. It spoke of a love that hadn't faded, a grief that still consumed him. It was a stark contrast to my own comfortable, perhaps too settled, marriage. Did Tom and I still have that kind of fire, that depth of connection? Or had it slowly, imperceptibly, been banked down over the decades, like embers glowing faintly under a layer of ash? The thought was disquieting. Not because I doubted Tom's love or mine for him, but because Mr. Abernathy's accidental revelation had inadvertently shone a light on the different ways people experience and express love and loss. His was a roaring, private inferno. Ours, a quiet, steady warmth. Was one better than the other? Or just different? I found myself feeling an odd sense of responsibility towards Mr. Abernathy. Not to interfere, of course, but to what? To simply hold that knowledge respectfully? To be a silent witness to a grief he thought was entirely private? It was a strange burden, this accidental intimacy. I wondered if he was sitting alone in his large, presumably quiet house, the silence as loud for him as he described. The thought filled me with a profound sadness. The next morning, Wednesday, dawned much like Tuesday, gray and quiet. I went about my routine, but there was a new undercurrent to my thoughts. Every time the phone buzzed, my heart gave a little jump. Would he call again? Text again by mistake? Or would the incident simply fade, an unspoken secret between us? I found myself tidying with a little less purpose, my gaze drifting to the window more often, not really seeing the familiar street outside, but replaying the conversation, the raw emotion in his voice, the shocking vulnerability of his words that I even considered, for a fleeting moment, making a casserole. A ridiculous thought, I know. The classic female response to crisis or grief. Feed it. But who would I give it to? "Here you go, Mr. Abernathy. Heard your garden was dying. Thought a tuna noodle bake might perk you up?" The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but the laugh died in my throat. This was too delicate, too raw for casseroles. Discretion was what he'd asked for, and discretion was what I would give. But the desire to do something, however small, lingered. Not for Mr. Abernathy, the powerful CEO, but for Arthur, the grieving widower. It was a new, unsettling feeling. Sarah Sterling, who often felt like a background character in my own life, had stumbled into the main narrative of someone else's hidden drama, someone I barely knew yet felt strangely connected to through a shared, albeit one-sided, moment of profound human vulnerability. The line between Tom's boss and a man in pain had blurred, and I wasn't sure how to navigate this new landscape. The only thing I was sure of was that my quiet Tuesdays, and perhaps my perception of the people around me, would never be quite the same. The shockwaves of that mistaken text were still reverberating, subtly reshaping the contours of my inner world. A couple of days passed, and the initial intensity of the incident began to subside, though it never fully left my thoughts. It was like a pebble dropped in a still pond. The ripples spread, faded, but the pebble remained at the bottom, a tangible reminder. I didn't hear from Mr. Abernathy again, and I told myself that was for the best. He probably wanted to forget the entire mortifying episode, and my silence was the best way to help him do that. Tom remained blissfully unaware, his days filled with the usual concerns of work and home, his evenings with the newspaper and the television. Life in the Sterling household continued its steady, predictable rhythm. Then, on Friday afternoon, I was at Henderson's, our local grocery store, picking up a few things for the weekend. Henderson's was one of those places where you always ran into someone you knew, a hub of Oak Haven's social life, such as it was. I was in the produce aisle, trying to decide between a head of romaine or iceberg lettuce, the eternal dilemma, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. A voice that now sent a little jolt through me. "Mrs. Sterling? Sarah?" I turned, my shopping basket clutched a little too tightly. It was him, Mr. Abernathy, Arthur Abernathy, standing there in the bright fluorescent light of the supermarket, looking remarkably ordinary in a casual tweed jacket and dark trousers, a stark contrast to the sharp business suits Tom always described. He looked older than I remembered from the occasional company picnic years ago, his face etched with fine lines, his shoulders slightly stooped. And his eyes, they held a deep-seated weariness that even the polite, almost hesitant smile he offered couldn't quite conceal. It was the same weariness I'd sensed in his voice over the phone. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, trying to keep my tone light, casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world, running into Tom's boss near the avocados. "Hello. How are you?" A stupid question, given what I knew, but it was the automatic social lubricant.
I'm
doing reasonably well. Thank you," he replied, his gaze meeting mine for a brief moment before flicking away, a hint of that earlier awkwardness returning. He was holding a small basket with only a few items, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a single, shrink-wrapped steak. A bachelor's shopping list. I wanted to again apologize for that unfortunate text message earlier this week. I hope it didn't cause you any undue distress. "Not at all," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Please don't give it another thought. These things happen." I offered what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Smartphones, eh? Too smart for their own good sometimes." He gave a small, wry chuckle, a sound so unexpected it almost startled me. "Indeed. It seems my Luddite tendencies are regularly proven correct. I should probably stick to carrier pigeons." The attempted humor, however slight, seemed to ease the tension a little. "They might be a bit messy in the office," I ventured, and he actually smiled then, a genuine, fleeting smile that reached his eyes and, for a second, erased some of the weariness. "A valid point, Mrs. Sterling," he conceded. He shifted his basket from one hand to the other. There was an awkward pause, the kind where you both know there's an elephant in the room, or in this case, a dying garden and a heartbroken message. I wondered if he was going to say more, to allude to the content of the text, but he didn't. And I certainly wasn't going to bring it up. Instead, he surprised me. "Tom is a good man, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice softer now, more thoughtful. "A valuable employee. Dedicated. Reliable. We're fortunate to have him at the mill." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. It was one thing for Tom to say his boss valued him, quite another to hear it directly from Mr. Abernathy himself, especially in this unexpected setting. He enjoys his work there. It's been his whole life, really. "As it has been mine in many ways," Mr. Abernathy said, and there was a shadow in his eyes again, a hint of that deeper melancholy. "Abernathy paper is, well, it's more than just a business to me." He paused, then seemed to catch himself, as if he'd said too much. "Well," he said, his tone becoming more brisk, "I mustn't keep you from your shopping. It was good to see you, Mrs. Sterling." "You too, Mr. Abernathy," I replied. "Have a good weekend." "And you." He gave a slight nod, a ghost of his formal self, and then he moved on. Pushing his small basket towards the checkout aisles, I stood there for a moment, next to the perfectly stacked apples and oranges, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the encounter hadn't been more awkward. A continued sympathy for this man who carried his grief so privately. And something else, a sense of a door having been opened, just a crack, into another person's life. A life far different and more complex than I had ever imagined. His compliment about Tom had been kind, unexpected. It showed a thoughtfulness I hadn't associated with the stern Mr. Abernathy of Tom's work anecdotes. As I continued my own shopping, I couldn't shake the image of him with his solitary steak and loaf of bread. It painted a picture of a lonely existence, of meals eaten in silence, of a large house echoing with memories. The dying garden he'd mentioned in his text, it wasn't just a metaphor, was it? It was likely a real place, a place he'd perhaps shared with Eleanor, now falling into neglect as his own hope waned. The brief encounter in Henderson's didn't dispel the secret of his text. If anything, it made it more real, more human. He wasn't just a voice on the phone anymore or a name Tom mentioned. He was a man I'd looked in the eye, a man whose sadness was visible if you knew, even accidentally, where to look. And I found myself thinking about Eleanor again and about gardens and about the parts of ourselves that wither when we lose someone we love. It was a lot to be pondering over a choice of lettuce, but my mind seemed to have a will of its own these days. The ordinary aisles of the grocery store felt imbued with an extraordinary undercurrent of human sorrow and resilience. And I, Sarah Sterling, felt myself standing at a quiet crossroads, an unwitting confidant, wondering if this unexpected glimpse into another's hidden life would somehow, subtly, change the course of my own. The following week, an unusual invitation arrived in the mail. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sterling in elegant calligraphy. Not our usual junk mail or bills. I opened it with a sense of curiosity. Inside, an equally elegant card requested the pleasure of our company at a charity gala hosted by the Abernathy Foundation to be held at the Oakhaven Country Club in 3 weeks' time. The Abernathy Foundation was Mr. Abernathy's philanthropic arm, known for its generous contributions to local causes, the library, the hospital, community projects. Tom and I had never been invited to one of their galas before. These were usually reserved for the town's upper echelons, major donors, people of influence. Not for salaried mill employees like Tom and their wives. "Well, this is a surprise," Tom said that evening, examining the invitation with a bewildered expression. "Abernathy Foundation Gala? Why on earth would they invite us? Maybe they're expanding the guest list," I suggested, trying to sound casual, though my heart was doing a little flutter kick. My encounter with Mr. Abernathy in the grocery store, his kind words about Tom, and now this. Was there a connection? Or was I reading too much into a simple, perhaps randomly generated, invitation? Tom grunted, still skeptical. "Old man Abernathy doesn't do anything randomly. There's always a reason."
He looked at me.
"You didn't say anything to him about wanting to go to a fancy party when you bumped into him at Henderson's, did you?" "Of course not, Tom," I said, a little indignant. "We barely exchanged pleasantries. He just said you were a good employee."
"Oh."
"Well, that's good then." He seemed mollified. Still a bit odd. These things are usually $100 a plate, minimum. Stuffy affairs, mostly. Lots of speeches. He didn't sound overly enthusiastic, but I felt a flicker of something else. Not exactly excitement, but anticipation? A chance to see Mr. Abernathy in his own element, perhaps? Or maybe just an excuse to get dressed up, to step out of our comfortable routine for an evening. And a tiny, persistent voice in the back of my mind whispered, maybe it was his way of what? Acknowledging our unspoken secret in some subtle, formal way? Or simply a gesture of goodwill stemming from our brief, awkward encounters? Well, I think it might be nice to go, I said carefully. We haven't been out to anything like this in ages. Tom shrugged. If you want to, Sal. I guess it wouldn't hurt to show our faces. Might be good for, office politics being seen there. So it was decided. We would attend the Abernathy Foundation Gala. As I marked the date on our kitchen calendar, I couldn't shake the feeling that this invitation was more than just a social obligation. It felt like another small, almost imperceptible ripple emanating from that mistaken text message, from that glimpse into a hidden life. The story, it seemed, was not yet over. And I found myself wondering, with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, quiet curiosity, what the next chapter might hold, not just for Mr. Abernathy, but for me as well. The quiet waters of my life had been disturbed, and I sensed that things were slowly, subtly, beginning to shift. The 3 weeks leading up to the gala passed with a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying anticipation, at least for me. Tom, bless his heart, promptly forgot about the event until I reminded him a few days before that he needed to find his good suit and make sure it still fit. I, on the other hand, found myself thinking about it more than I probably should have. What would I wear? It had been years since I'd needed a truly formal gown. My wardrobe consisted mostly of comfortable slacks, sensible blouses, and a couple of dresses reserved for Sunday service or the occasional dinner out at a local restaurant. Nothing that screamed charity gala at the country club. This led to an unexpected shopping trip with my sister, Carol, who lived in the next town over and had a much better sense of style than I did. Carol, ever practical but with an eye for a bargain, steered me towards a lovely deep sapphire blue dress, elegant but not overly flashy, with long sleeves and a soft drape that was surprisingly flattering. "It brings out your eyes, Sarah," she declared, and for the first time in a long while, looking at my reflection in the brightly lit department store mirror, I felt a little flicker of that younger, more confident version of myself. It was a good feeling. As the day of the gala approached, a knot of nerves began to tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just about the fancy dress or navigating a room full of Oakhaven's elite. It was about Mr. Abernathy. Would he be there? Of course, he would. It was his foundation's event. Would he speak to us? Would there be any acknowledgement of the strange, unspoken thing that lay between us, that raw, desperate text message that had given me such an intimate and unintended window into his soul? Or would he be the distant, formal Mr. Abernathy, the CEO, with no hint of the vulnerable man I now knew existed? The evening of the gala arrived, crisp and clear, the autumn air carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Tom, looking surprisingly dapper in his dark suit, albeit a little uncomfortable in the starched collar, grumbled good-naturedly about monkey suits, but seemed secretly pleased when I told him how handsome he looked. I felt a flutter of nerves as I fastened a simple pearl necklace, my reflection in the hall mirror showing a woman who looked different. More polished, perhaps. A little apprehensive, But also, if I was honest with myself, a little excited. The Oakhaven Country Club was ablaze with lights, cars pulling up to the grand entrance, valets scurrying. Inside, the ballroom buzzed with conversation and the clinking of glasses. It was all very elegant, a world away from our quiet evenings at home. We found our assigned table, thankfully shared with a few other couples from the Mills management team whom Tom knew, which eased some of the initial awkwardness. Mr. Abernathy was, as expected, a commanding presence. He stood near the entrance for a while, greeting guests, a figure of quiet authority in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked every inch the successful magnate, shaking hands, offering polite smiles. There was no outward sign of the grieving man from the text message, no hint of the weary soul I'd encountered in the grocery store. It was as if he wore his public persona like a suit of armor, impenetrable and flawless. My heart did a little flip when I saw him glance towards our table. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room. Just a fleeting second. Did I imagine a flicker of recognition, something more than just a CEO surveying his guests? Or was it just my own heightened awareness projecting meaning onto a casual glance? He didn't approach us then, and I told myself it was natural. He was the host. He had many people to greet. The dinner was excellent, the speeches mercifully brief. Tom actually seemed to be enjoying himself, chatting with his colleagues. I found myself mostly observing, taking in the scene, my gaze occasionally drifting towards Mr. Abernathy, who was now seated at the head table on a slightly raised dais. He looked solitary even surrounded by people, a thoughtful, almost melancholic expression settling on his features when he wasn't actively engaged in conversation. Later, as coffee and dessert were being served, and the band began to play softly, there was a lull in the formal proceedings. People started to mingle more freely. I saw Mr. Abernathy rise from his table and begin to make his way around the room, stopping to speak with various guests. My pulse quickened slightly. Would he come to our table? And then he was there, standing beside Tom. "Tom," he said, his voice that familiar gravelly baritone. "Good to see you here." "And Mrs. Sterling." He inclined his head towards me, his expression polite, perhaps a little guarded. "Mr. Abernathy," Tom said, rising slightly in his seat, respectful. "Thank you for inviting us. It's a lovely event." "The foundation does good work," Mr. Abernathy said, his gaze sweeping briefly over the room. "It's important to give back to the community that supports us." He paused, and then his eyes met mine again, and this time there was no mistaking it. There was a directness, a quiet intensity in his look that seemed to acknowledge our previous, unusual encounters. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a little softer, "I was hoping I might have a brief word with you, if you wouldn't mind. Perhaps by the terrace? It's a little quieter out there." My heart leaped. Tom looked surprised, then curious, but he just nodded. "Of course, Mr. Abernathy." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, but nodded. "Certainly." As I excused myself and rose to follow Mr. Abernathy towards the French doors leading out to the club's terrace, I could feel Tom's eyes, and probably a few other curious pairs, on my back. The air outside was cool, a welcome relief from the warmth of the ballroom. The terrace overlooked the darkened expanse of the golf course, the only lights coming from the distant street lamps and the soft glow filtering through the windows behind us. The music from the ballroom was a muted thrum here. Mr. Abernathy walked to the stone balustrade, looking out into the night for a moment before turning to me. He seemed to relax slightly in the relative quiet and dimness. "Thank you for stepping out here with me, Sarah," he said, using my first name for the first time. It felt significant. I know this might seem a little unorthodox. It's all right, Arthur, I replied, reciprocating the gesture, though the name felt a little strange on my tongue when addressing Tom's formidable boss. It's a beautiful evening. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. It is. He was silent for a moment, and I waited, a sense of anticipation building within me. Why had he asked to speak with me alone? Sarah, he began, his voice low and earnest, I wanted to thank you properly for your discretion, your understanding regarding that unfortunate text message, and for your kindness when we met in the supermarket. It meant more to me than I can probably express. Arthur, please, I said gently. There's no need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same. Perhaps, he said, a hint of skepticism in his tone. But not everyone possesses your quiet grace, your empathy. I was in a rather dark place that day. Still am in many ways. That message. He paused, looking down at his hands resting on the balustrade. It was meant for my late wife, Eleanor. Sometimes I still write to her, as it were, or speak to her. A foolish old man's habit, I suppose. I was typing out my thoughts, intending to save it, perhaps read it at her graveside later. And in my distraction, my clumsiness with these infernal devices, he shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating gesture. My heart ached for him. It's not foolish, Arthur, I said softly. It's human. Grief takes many forms. And love endures. The words came out before I could think too much about them, but they felt true. He looked up at me then, and in the dim light from the ballroom, I saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored the pain in his mistaken text. It was a look of profound sadness, but also, surprisingly, a flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps, at being truly seen, truly understood, without judgment. Eleanor loved her garden, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was her sanctuary. After she was gone, I tried to keep it up, but it felt like a betrayal almost, like tending a memory that was too painful to touch. So I let it go. And yes, he added, a faint, sad smile. It is dying. And a part of me with it, just as I wrote. You were not meant to see that, Sarah. But since you did, well, perhaps there's a strange sort of solace in someone else knowing the truth, even if it was accidental. I can only imagine how difficult it must be, I said, my voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even myself. Losing someone you love so deeply, it changes everything. He nodded slowly. It does. The world loses its color, its savor. Work became my only refuge, my only distraction. But it's a cold comfort. He turned to look out at the dark golf course again. For a long time, I felt ashamed of my grief, almost. As if it were a weakness a man in my position couldn't afford to show. So I built walls. Those walls must be very lonely to live behind, I found myself saying, the words gentle but direct. He turned back to me, a look of surprise on his face, quickly followed by a thoughtful frown. You are remarkably perceptive, Sarah Sterling. He was silent for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath.
Yes.
They are. Terribly lonely. It was a moment of pure, unadorned honesty. Here, on this quiet terrace, away from the glittering ballroom, the formidable Mr. Abernathy, CEO, had vanished, replaced by Arthur, a man carrying an immense burden of sorrow, a man who had, for a few brief minutes, allowed his carefully constructed walls to crumble. And I, Sarah, Tom's wife, had somehow become the person to witness it. There was no shock this time, only a profound sense of shared humanity, a deep, quiet empathy that flowed between us in the cool night air. It was an unexpected connection, born from a mistake, nurtured by a moment of shared vulnerability in a grocery store, and now, finding a quiet voice on a country club terrace. It was, I realized, a deeply emotional experience, consensual in its unfolding honesty, and it was changing something within me, making me see that even in the grandest of lives, or the most ordinary, the human heart beats with the same needs for understanding and connection. The night, I sensed, was far from over, and this unexpected conversation felt like it was leading somewhere significant, somewhere I hadn't anticipated, but was now, strangely, ready to explore. He looked at me, a small, almost shy smile on his lips. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, more reflective, "Eleanor would have liked you. She had a way of seeing past the exterior, right into the heart of things. Much like you, I suspect." The compliment, so personal and unexpected, warmed me more than the elegant shawl I wore. "That's a very kind thing to say, Arthur. Thank you." "It's the truth," he replied simply. He paused, then continued, as if a dam had finally broken, allowing words he'd held back for years to flow. "After she passed, the house, our home, it became so quiet. Too quiet. The silence was deafening, just as I wrote in that unfortunate text. Her laughter used to fill every room. Her presence was everywhere. And then just absence." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "I filled my days with work, meetings, reports. Anything to avoid going back to that quiet house. But you can't outrun grief, can you? It's always there, waiting." "No," I agreed softly. "You can't outrun it. I think perhaps you just learn to carry it. It becomes a part of you, like a shadow that never quite leaves, even on the sunniest days." I thought of my own smaller griefs, the empty nests, the subtle fading of youthful dreams, pale comparisons to his profound loss, yet the sentiment felt universally true. He nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the darkness. "Carry it, yes. That's a good way to put it. For years, I felt like I was drowning in it. Lately, I suppose I'm just trying to stay afloat." He turned back to me, his eyes searching mine. "Your understanding, Sarah, your lack of judgment, it's been a small light. A lifeline almost in a very unexpected way. I'm glad if I could offer any comfort at all," I said, my voice sincere. "Sometimes, just knowing you're not entirely alone in your feelings can make a difference." "It has," he affirmed. "It truly has." He then shifted slightly, a different kind of thoughtfulness entering his expression. "You know, that garden? Eleanor's garden. It's at our old home, a place just outside Oakhaven. I haven't been able to bring myself to sell the house, but I rarely go there anymore. It's full of ghosts. Happy ones mostly, but they still haunt." "I can imagine," I said. "Gardens need tending just like hearts. Left alone, both can become overgrown, wild, perhaps beautiful in their neglect, but also deeply melancholic." "The Abernathy Foundation," he continued, a new note in his voice, "we support many community projects, as you know. We recently acquired a piece of land adjacent to the new library wing, and we've been discussing creating a community garden there. A place where people can come together, grow things, a sort of living memorial, perhaps. We were looking for someone with a passion for it, someone with a vision to help shape it." I listened, intrigued, wondering where this was leading. He looked directly at me then, a tentative, almost hopeful expression on his face. Sarah, this might be entirely presumptuous, and please feel free to say no, but when you spoke of gardens and loss and carrying grief, and when I saw the kindness in your eyes that day in the supermarket, it made me think. Would you ever consider being involved in such a project? Perhaps helping to design it, to guide its creation? Your empathy, your quiet strength. I believe you could help create something truly special there. Something that could bring solace and joy to many. Something that Eleanor, I think, would have approved of. I was taken aback.
Completely. Me?
Design a community garden? I was just Sarah Sterling, who pottered about with a few petunias and some herbs. I had no qualifications, no experience in public projects. My heart pounded. It was an extraordinary offer, born from this strange, unexpected connection between us. Arthur,
I.
I don't know what to say. I stammered, truly stunned. That's an incredibly generous thought, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm just an amateur gardener, at best. Passion is often more valuable than qualifications, Sarah, he said gently. And I sensed a passion in you. Not just for plants, but for healing, perhaps. For connection. He smiled faintly. Besides, the foundation would provide all the necessary resources, experts to consult with. What we need is someone with heart. Someone who understands what such a place could mean to people. I looked out at the dark grounds, my mind racing. A community garden, a living memorial, a place of solace and joy. The idea resonated with me on a level I hadn't anticipated. It was an opportunity to do something meaningful, something outside the quiet confines of my own life. Something that, in a strange way, felt connected to the very emotions his mistaken text had stirred in me. That sense of shared humanity, of hidden sorrows, and the possibility of growth, even from pain. Could I think about it? I asked, my voice a little breathless. It's a lot to take in. Of course, he said, his smile warm and genuine now. Take all the time you need. There's no pressure. It was just a thought, an impulse perhaps, but one that felt right. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. This has my direct number, the one that, doesn't send errant messages, he added with a touch of dry humor. If you feel it's something you might be interested in exploring, please call me. I took the card, my fingers closing around the crisp vellum. Thank you, Arthur. I will. I promise I'll give it serious thought. That's all I ask. He seemed content. The tension that had been around him earlier, the deep weariness, seemed to have lifted, even if just a little. He looked more at peace than I had ever seen him. And Sarah, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thank you for listening, for not recoiling from an old man's grief. There is nothing to recoil from, Arthur, I said softly. Only a heart that remembers. We stood in comfortable silence for another moment, the cool night air a balm. Then he offered a small, respectful nod. I should probably return to my guests, and you to yours. Tom will be wondering where I've spirited you away to. I smiled. He probably thinks you're offering me a job counting paper clips at the mill. Arthur chuckled, a genuine, hearty sound this time, and it was wonderful to hear. Perhaps I should. You seem to have a knack for sorting things out. He offered me his arm, a gesture of old-fashioned gallantry. May I escort you back inside? Thank you. As we walked back towards the warmth and light of the ballroom, I felt a profound shift within me. The world felt a little brighter, a little more full of possibility. The encounter on the terrace hadn't been just a conversation. It had been an opening. An invitation not just to a project, but to a different way of seeing myself and my place in the world. The mistaken text, the shocking glimpse into a private sorrow, had led, incredibly, to this moment of mutual respect, emotional connection, and the potential for personal discovery and growth. It was, as the clickbait title of a YouTube story might proclaim, unbelievable. But it was happening. And as I glanced at Arthur Abernathy, no longer just Tom's boss, but a man I felt a deep, platonic kinship with, I knew that whatever I decided about the garden project, my life had already been changed in a quiet, yet significant, way. The seeds of something new had been sown, unexpectedly, in the fertile ground of shared vulnerability. Back at our table, Tom looked at me with a curious, slightly concerned expression. "Everything all right, Sal? You were out there for a while." I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that I felt light up my whole face. "Everything's fine, Tom," I said, squeezing his hand. "More than fine, actually." I didn't elaborate further, not then. Some things needed to be savored, to be processed in the quiet spaces of one's own heart. But as I looked around the glittering ballroom, at the faces of people I knew and people I didn't, I saw them all a little differently. Everyone, I realized, had their own hidden gardens, their own private sorrows, their own quiet battles. And sometimes, all it took was an unexpected connection, a moment of shared humanity, to make the world feel a little less lonely, a little more hopeful. The drive home with Tom was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, not the empty silence I sometimes felt. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Oak Haven slide by, the business card from Arthur Abernathy tucked safely in my evening bag. A community garden. The idea took root in my mind, images of flowers and vegetables, of children laughing and old folks resting on benches, of hands in the soil, connecting with the earth, connecting with each other. It was a daunting prospect, but also an incredibly exciting one. "So, what did Mr. Abernathy want to talk to you about for so long?" Tom finally asked, his curiosity getting the better of him as we pulled into our driveway. I turned to him, a soft smile on my face. "He wanted to talk about a garden, Tom," I said. "A new one. A garden for everyone." Tom looked bewildered. "A garden? Abernathy? I thought he only cared about profit margins and pulp yields." "He cares about more than that, I think," I replied thoughtfully. "Much more." Over the next few days, I thought long and hard about Arthur's offer. I walked around my own small garden, looking at the fading glories of autumn, and tried to imagine a larger space, a communal space, filled with life and color. I researched community gardens online, looked at designs, read stories about their impact on neighborhoods. The more I learned, the more the idea captivated me. It wasn't just about plants, it was about building community, fostering connections, creating beauty and sustenance from the earth. It was about hope. There was a part of me, the cautious, sensible Sarah, that whispered doubts. What did I really know about such things? Could I handle the responsibility, the public scrutiny? But then there was another voice, a quieter, more insistent one. The voice that had felt that flicker of yearning for something more. This voice told me that this was an opportunity, a gift, a chance to step outside my comfortable routine and make a difference, however small. A chance to cultivate not just a garden, but also a part of myself that had lain dormant for too long. A week after the gala, I picked up the phone and dialed the number on Arthur Abernathy's card. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Arthur," I said, my own voice clear and steady. "It's Sarah Sterling. I've been thinking about your proposal, about the community garden." "Sarah," he replied, and I could hear the hopeful anticipation in his tone. And I took a deep breath. And I would be honored to be a part of it. A sigh of what sounded like genuine relief came down the line. Sarah, that's wonderful news. Truly wonderful. And so began a new chapter in my life. The work on the Oak Haven Community Garden project was challenging, demanding, and utterly exhilarating. I met with architects, landscape designers, and a committee of enthusiastic volunteers Arthur had already started to assemble. I discovered I had opinions, ideas, even a certain knack for organization and diplomacy that I never knew I possessed. Arthur, true to his word, provided unwavering support from the Abernathy Foundation, but he largely stepped back, allowing me and the committee to take the lead. He would visit the site occasionally, a quiet observer, a hint of a smile on his face as he watched the barren patch of land begin to transform. Our relationship settled into a comfortable, respectful friendship. We'd have coffee sometimes, discussing the garden's progress, but also talking about books, about life, about Eleanor. He spoke of her more easily now, the sharp edges of his grief softened by time and, perhaps, by the healing power of sharing his memories. He was still a private man, but the walls around him were noticeably lower. He even started visiting Eleanor's garden at their old home again. He told me one afternoon, not to mourn what was lost, but to remember what had been, and to find a quiet peace there. He'd even started to pull a few weeds. He confessed with a wry smile. Tom, initially a bit bemused by my sudden immersion in this new project, became surprisingly supportive. He saw the passion in my eyes, the new energy I had, and I think it pleased him. He even volunteered on a couple of Saturdays to help build raised beds, grumbling good-naturedly, but clearly proud of what we were achieving. Our own quiet companionship found new depths as we shared this new purpose, this new adventure in our later years. It wasn't a dramatic overhaul of our marriage, but a subtle enrichment, like good compost nourishing a well-established plant. The Oak Haven Community Garden officially opened the following spring. It was a beautiful, sunny day, the kind that makes you believe in new beginnings. The beds were bursting with young plants, the pathways were neat, and the air was filled with the happy chatter of families, children, and seniors, all eager to get their hands dirty. Arthur gave a short, heartfelt speech, his voice clear and strong. He spoke of community, of growth, of Eleanor's love for gardens, and he paid tribute to the volunteers with a special, warm acknowledgement for me, for my vision and tireless dedication. As I stood there, watching the people of Oak Haven explore their new garden, a profound sense of contentment washed over me. This vibrant, living space had sprung from an accidental text message, from a moment of shared vulnerability. It was a testament to the unexpected ways life can unfold, the surprising connections that can be forged, and the quiet strength that can be found in showing our true selves, sorrows and all. My life hadn't become a whirlwind of nonstop excitement. I was still Sarah Sterling from Oak Haven. I still made Tom his dinner, still enjoyed my quiet mornings with a cup of tea. But something fundamental had shifted. I had discovered a new dimension to myself, a capacity for leadership and creativity I hadn't known I possessed. I had forged an unlikely but deeply meaningful friendship. And I had learned that even in the most ordinary of lives, or behind the most formidable of facades, there lies a rich, complex tapestry of human emotion, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to connect. That mistaken text from Mr. Abernathy had indeed been shocking. And what happened afterwards was, in its own quiet, profound way, something you truly wouldn't believe unless you'd lived it. It wasn't a dramatic scandal or a torrid affair, as some might imagine from such a story title. It was something far more real, far more resonant, a story of emotional connection, personal discovery, and the enduring power of mutual respect. A story of how a dying garden and a few misdirected words of grief could ultimately lead to a place of new life, new growth, and a quiet, unexpected blooming in the autumn of my own life. And for that, I would always be grateful.